Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. Now today, over 1,000 prisoners have been released early as part of a government scheme to ease capacity in our prisons. It's the first set of what will eventually be around 5,000 prisoners released early as part of this scheme. Joining me now to discuss is Ian Acheson, a former prison governor and Home Office official, and David Shipley, a former prisoner who writes about prisons issues. Ian and David, thank you for coming on Spectator TV. Ian, start us off. I mean, one of the most basic thing a state should be able to do is keep people locked up for as long as they've been sentenced for. Yeah, now we've got the case today where thousands of prisoners are going to be released over the next sort of weeks and months. Yeah. How did we get to this point? What's happened here?
I think we got to this point in a sense very simply, and that is that we failed to plan for the capacity of the prison system as it now is. Years ago, these numbers were predicted. We failed to have sufficient modern, humane buildings to house prisoners and staff in. We failed to recruit and retain decent staff. In fact, 20% of prison officers, or 25%, were culled between 2010 and 16 as the population lower than it is now, but remained static and rising. So we've now got to a perfect storm where this is the worst possible thing to do, this mass release, apart from any one of the alternatives. So, as I've said on TV this morning, this is the, Starmer gifted a hospital pass from the outgoing administration. People's memories, I think, are going to be very short, though, but the Tories will only have, a certain shelf life. This is all on the government now. Its first duty is to protect its citizens. And what we've done effectively in the mass release of prisoners, which is unavoidable, is we've transferred the risk from the prison landings in order to free up space so that serious offenders can come into custody to the community. And all the evidence is, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, and David's written an excellent article for The Spectator about it, that the probation service is simply unfit to cope with that risk. So I'm afraid, reoffending is inevitable, and harm committed that otherwise wouldn't have been committed on further victims is also inevitable because of what the government has been forced to do.
I mean, David, Ian mentions there that, Keir Starmer's kind of managed to dodge a lot of blame for this so far by saying, yes, we've inherited a mess with the prison system, which certainly seems to be the case. Do you think today, when we sort of see videos of prisoners sort of leaving prison, leaving places like HMP at Wandsworth with champagne corks being popped, do you think that kind of blame shifts back onto Starmer now?
I think to an extent it has to, right. The prison system and the justice system that the new government inherited was a complete mess. That's absolutely true. They have been in power, though, for a couple of months and are making choices. They have chosen to do this early release scheme, and they've chosen to do it in a way in which the probation service, as I understand, were not being told who they were going to be responsible for until, in some cases, last week. So probation officers who are already really overworked, and the probation service is understaffed to the tune of about 2,000 probation officers at the moment, are suddenly being given new files to deal with. They have to try to familiarise themselves with these offenders, understand what their risk profile is, what support they might need to be managed. That was a choice. And the thing about this policy is it's only going to buy a small amount of time. 5,500 prisoners sounds like a lot, but in reality, we know that between 55 and 59% of prisoners who were released from prison will get recalled. We know that the proven reoffending rate is about 26%. That's prisoners released who will offend and be proven to offend within a year. What that means is we will see a spike in crime as a result of this, and also we might well see 3,000 or more of these prisoners being recalled pretty quickly. So that 5,500 spaces will be consumed pretty rapidly by recalls and just by the growth in the population in the prison system, which, as Ian pointed out recently, is growing by about 1,000 prisoners a month. So the government announced this policy 2 months ago. Since then, they haven't really done anything to fix the mid and long-term issues. They announced a relatively small-scale expansion in prison places, and I think they promised about 567 new spaces by 5th of September. And when I rang the MOJ about a week and a half ago to ask them how that was going, they said they were almost halfway through that, but they really, really were sure they would be doing it by the 5th of September. But they couldn't explain how they were so certain. So I was a little bit sceptical about that. And I think that's the issue. We need to actually affect change in the big pieces of the justice system. Otherwise, we're going to be back here really soon. And you've seen this weekend, the government is already kind of flying this balloon of the sending prisoners to Estonia idea, which was a terrible idea when the last government came up with it. But the fact they're already talking about that suggests to me they recognise they haven't fixed this problem.
I mean, Ian, do you have any faith that the MOJ can increase capacity to solve this issue?
No. I mean, even if they were given all the headwind they needed, even if all the planning objections were overruled, we're not going to build prisons anything like as quick as we would need to do so with the current projections for people coming into custody. So something else has to give, and David's absolutely right. This breathing space is already being choked off by 1,000 people, I believe, have now been at least charged to custody for rioting. You're going to have, as David said, multiple returns to custody. I mean, just going back to the probation service and understanding psychology of breaches by probation staff back to custody. If you look at the absolutely scandalous sickness rates for frontline probation staff, 59% of that sickness over the last 12 months was stress related. Now, if you are overloading the system even more, and bearing in mind on average these people are working at 110 to 130% of capacity with the workload and the risk management they've already got. If you're then overloading this even further, what you'll probably get is, a fairly rational psychological response. People will be terrified of dropping the ball on newly released prisoners. So I think the indication there is they'd be much more likely to breach them back to custody rather than be able to take the time to understand their needs and to deal with them. I mean, we've got the probation service that's facing problems, but prisoners who come out of custody, and David will know this from personal experience, they've got a multitude of other problems. They'll need GPs, they'll need to go to the benefits office potentially, they will need homelessness support, they will need drug and alcohol rehabilitation, they will need pharmacies that are open and ready for them. There's an enormous number of things that have to be ready that were knackered to begin with in relation to NHS services, for example. So, this is very, very risky, but it's the lesser of two evils, I guess. A political calculation had to be made, as David said at the start, that this was the only thing to do. And it will be all eyes on Keir Starmer and Shabana Mahmood in the short term to deal with the overcrowding crisis. Now, just one thing to say to that in relation to Charlie Taylor's Chief Inspector of Prisons annual report that was released this morning, which has basically run out of superlatives to describe how bad it is. I have never seen a report as bad from the criminal justice system. It is apocalyptic. But actually what he did also mention in his preamble that people might not have picked up on is that we have overcrowded prisons. Not very many of them, but certainly a few overcrowded Victorian prisons that are actually doing quite well. Swansea and Leicester are two of them. And I make the point simply to say that when we've dealt with overcrowding, there is an enormous amount more to do to repair the culture and the leadership of His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, to be able to fit it to deliver the protection of the public and to restore this to a proper uniformed national law enforcement agency, which has basically fallen apart, certainly due to overcrowding and lack of investment. But there's something else going on there as well. And unless you fix the cultural and organisational sickness that pervades this agency, then you're never going to properly solve the whole system. But there are so many bits, and there's so many moving parts to this crisis that it's going to take quite a lot of command and control, such as, to be fair, we have seen, whether it's right or wrong or risky. It's going to take a lot more of that decisive action. Everybody talks piously about a royal commission. We can't wait for a royal commission. It's going to be years away. You've got at best, what do you think, David? 15 months, 14 months before we're back at square one.
I mean, I think next year the prisons will be full again. I think that's the point about the culture in the prisons is really important. What I saw when I was a prisoner at Wandsworth is it's not just about the lack of staffing. There's a complete lack of appetite amongst prison management to set and oversee a culture. And that could be really petty. An example I often give is that in Wandsworth, as in many closed prisons, you're not allowed to vape on the landings. That's the rule. That's the official rule.
Right.
In reality, prisoners vape on the landings all the time. Many staff vape on the landings. And I once saw a new trainee officer arrive for their first day, and the first day I'd seen them anyway, and tell a prisoner not to vape and be laughed at by prisoners and by their colleagues. And that might seem like a really minor point, but it points to a real toxic culture where actually the rules don't matter, or the rules are very contingent on whether an officer can be bothered to apply them. And you see it in the reports of the inspectors when they go into these prisons. They talk about, the stench of cannabis being smoked everywhere, and officers do nothing about it. And again, I saw that time and time again at Wandsworth. The smell of spice or of cannabis will be pouring out of a cell. Everyone knows that the man in there or the men in there are smoking. Nothing's done about it. And I think a lot of that is on the heads of the management in prisons, because you don't see prison governors, or even in many cases custodial managers who are the next grade down, walking the landings and ensuring that there's a consistent culture of following the rules. And what that means is, people who go to prison, including me, went to prison because we broke society's rules. We did something wrong and we were punished for it. We should all want a prison system which teaches people that actually they should obey the rules. I think most people who go and spend time as inmates in our prisons will walk away with a view of rules that they are contingent on circumstance. Really, they're a tool of the powerful, not a moral standard. And actually, if you get the right people on side, you can avoid the rules. And that is incredibly toxic. And that won't be solved by funding or more staff. That is a rot in our prison system which needs to change.
And do you think in the nature of this release system sort of plays into that, in the sense of people are meant to do usually 50% of their sentence, they're being let out early? Is it kind of saying to people that the rules aren't going to be applied even in this case?
There was a report outside Wandsworth Prison with prisoners coming out and celebrating, one prisoner sort of saying he's going to vote for Starmer forevermore. And my sort of sense of that is, this is the humiliation of the state in action. How have we got to a point where we are letting people, we've got justice by logistics, not justice by just desserts, if you like. And then on the other hand, we talked about this earlier, didn't we? We're probably releasing some people 3 weeks earlier than they would have been released,
right,
who are almost inevitably going to go on, given the profile of these offenders, to reoffend anyway, because nothing has been done of any meaningful value in prison to address their offending behaviour. Now, that's not going to be much comfort for a victim that gets victimised, who otherwise would not have been had these people been in prison. But I think there is something in what you're saying there that this is a surrender. It's a surrender of justice. Now, you could actually also argue a lot of these people shouldn't be in custody. I'm very much in favour of clearing prisons of non-violent, addicted drug offenders who commit acquisitive crimes, for example. And there's a pretty sizable number of people in prison who are, repeat offenders, who, magistrates have just got fed up with. They're on their 10th rodeo. Prolific shoplifters who, themselves destroy communities. The little corner shop, isn't your Waitrose of, well known to criminal justice commentariat. It's a place where, you can't have CCTV cameras, you can't have a security guard. These places operate in working class communities like where I came from on tiny margins. And they're being closed because of this behaviour. So what I'm saying is, it's not unharmful, but it needs to be dealt with in a completely different way. So I think compulsory detention in a secure NHS facility, which is totally geared towards rehabilitation of their drug habit, would be a potential way to hold down what would otherwise be an almost inevitable increase. Likewise, dealing with the 10,000 foreign national offenders, including 10,000 of them, by the way, or 11. Who have been released, who are still in this country, who haven't been deported. That would also make a difference. But this is a very, very uncomfortable day for justice. It's no question.
And David, we probably should mention as well that there are going to be sort of 2 tranches of releases. This is the first release, which is theoretically less long sentences, less severe offences. And then there's going to be another tranche in October of people sentenced for 5 years or more. I mean, do you think this is going to get worse? Do you think the public backlash is going to grow against this?
Well, I think my understanding is that it's more to do with the date that people would have been due for release. So I think there will be a bit of mixing of those two cohorts. I think the risk profiles are probably slightly more mixed up. It's about 1,700 today, I understand, and the MOJ are convinced they'll reach the 5,500 by the end of October. I think the problem is, however much the government says we're excluding these different offences, often they will just look at what's called the index offence. And this is slightly technical and boring, but there is a reason it's worth explaining. So when someone's in prison or being supervised by probation, there'll be a particular offence which is considered the important part of their offending. So if you are in prison because you've stolen cars, then your licence conditions will be around, if you do anything around stealing cars, we're definitely sending you back to prison. You do get lots of situations, though, where someone might be in prison for a particular offence and they might have done something else as well. So, there are the obvious example being that there are quite a lot of men in prisons who are domestic abusers, but are in prison for something drug-related or something inquisitive-related. Now, they might get released under this scheme, but if we aren't doing proper oversight and proper address checking, and in many cases police forces, like particularly the Met, I understand, are really remiss on that, they may well go back and hurt or and abuse their partners or former partners. So you're going to see a lot of that kind of risk behaviour as well. And because probation are so stretched and can't really oversee them, and because there hasn't been pre-release planning really, there's going to be a lot more of that. So I think we should be worried about it. And it's if anyone is saying there's no risk around this, it's they're being naive at best.
David mentioned domestic abuse there. I think originally the MOJ and Home Office said domestic abusers wouldn't be released. It now turns out they have. Do you think sort of vulnerable women are the kind of main losers of what's happening today?
Well, they certainly will be losers, and I think it's pretty inevitable that some of them will end up hurt by people who've been released early. It is part of a bigger conversation about societally men who hurt women, and men need to talk to each other about how that needs to change. So, we're dealing with the consequences. Well, what I'm trying to say is from the cradle here of offending behaviour. But I do think that some women are at risk. I mean, David has explained index offences. I'm also pretty unclear myself that if you have an offending history that includes domestic violence, but you're serving a consecutive sentence for something else, then you may slip through the net. But with the best will in the world, with a couple of weeks' notice sometimes about risk management of people who are ostensibly eligible for release. I just don't think there is the capability to make sure that absolutely everybody that should stay in is going to stay in. But again, they're out 2, 3, 4 weeks earlier than perhaps they might have been. And they're probably going to reoffend in any case. So that's the bigger question we need to answer. Why is it with, spending, I sometimes, when I do a sort of rubber chicken talk to Rotary clubs and so on, I do this thought experiment with them, and I say, imagine you're shareholders in an organisation with a turnover of 8 billion a year, and you make widgets, and 50% of your widgets fail within 12 months. What would you do? And they all say, I'm going to sack the manager. And I'm saying, well, you can't, because you're all shareholders in this, and I've just described the criminal justice system, recidivism rate for adult male offenders who are serving sentences of less than 12 months. So we have a uniquely bad record in rehabilitating people. And if we're not doing that, and all we're doing is, warehousing people in intolerable conditions, making them worse, we really do need to think again, because that's the point that we've got to, where we're actually having to release people earlier than a judge said they should spend in custody as punishment.
Ian, David, thank you for coming on Spectator TV.
Pleasure.
Thank you.